Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 through 15. And the text says, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown through the land and said, Let the Hebrews hear. So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Haven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in the pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, When I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal. I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Saul has been the answer to prayer for, the Israelites, even though it wasn't God's will, yet it was what they were asking for. And Saul was affirmed and anointed and chosen by God. And now we have the first story in the book of 1 Samuel, where Saul is definitely not the hero, and Saul is definitely not on the right side with God, and it was a quick turnaround here. Seems sort of abrupt. But if you remember right, this was probably written down quite a bit later, and so we don't know how many years it has passed in between these two things. Saul was 30 when he became king. And he reigned over Israel for 42 years. It doesn't say at what time in that 42 years this happened, but it could have been at any point in that time. It was likely not at the very end. It doesn't look like the thing that happened, the curse or the consequences happened right away, but it was probably not at the very beginning either. Number one says, what happened in last week's Bible study? A, Saul was confirmed as king. Yes. B, Samuel said farewell by reminding the Israelites of the number of times that God had saved them, and yet they forgot him and chased after idols. Yes. Samuel charged Israel to remain faithful. Yes. D, Samuel reminded them of the evil they had done by rejecting God and choosing a king. Could this be an idol too? Yes. And then E, Israel repented and Samuel didn't take away the king and the consequences of the actions that were promised, but he did tell them to follow God in the situation they are in and don't turn away from him. So what that means is he didn't say, okay, you've repented, now you're not going to take a king, and oh, by the way, you won't have the consequences that you were told you would have with the king. They have those consequences. In fact, the very beginning of chapter 13, we see Saul establishing a standing army, which was part of the thing that Samuel said, look, this is what's going to happen. He's going to take your children and they will have to fight for him. And so this is all part of the consequences. So he didn't change the circumstance. He didn't take away the consequences. He didn't take away the king. He said, but if your king and you obey God, then you're going to be fine. Of course, we get to this text and this story suggests that they didn't always do that, and the king did not always obey God, and that usually means that the rest of the people follow in the footsteps. We all have our own choices for sure, but leaders are held to a higher account because they have a tendency to lead people, and if they go in the wrong direction, the people go in the wrong direction. So number 2 says, what happened in 13:3 and 4? A, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and that's true. B, Saul had a trumpet blown throughout the land, and all Israel heard the news that Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. And C, the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. So all of those happened. It's interesting because in general, the author doesn't pass judgment on this attack, whether it was good or bad. It doesn't say whether Saul ordered it or whether it was Jonathan being youthful and ignorant or overstepping his bounds. It really doesn't tell us anything about that. It does seem that Jonathan, both in this story and in the coming stories, had a tendency to act, well, you might say he acts in faith and he says, well, God will save us. But it definitely does seem a lot of times that he's acting impulsively and perhaps foolishly. And so there was no war. Well, I mean, I imagine it was somewhat of a Cold War. There were attacks here and there, but mostly it was a standoff. But Jonathan went and attacked this Philistine outpost, and the next thing you know, the Philistines are assembling an army that it scares the Israelites to death, and they run and hide. So Jonathan poked the bear, if you will. So now maybe it was God's will that they poke the bear and they act in faith and they defeat the enemies that should have been wiped out when they came into the promised land to begin with. But it really doesn't say that for sure in this text, whether it is or whether it isn't. So, and number 3, what happened in 13:5 through 8? A, the Philistines assembled their soldiers, and their soldiers were so numerous, were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Yes. B, when the Israelites saw their situation, they hid, and some even crossed the Jordan to get away. And so the other side of the Jordan was where the Ammonites were attacking before, and the Philistines were in Canaan on the Israelite main side of the Jordan. So we talked about that a little bit in previous weeks, but some of them ran across because they were getting away from the Philistines. Now they may be running right into an area that the Ammonites are dangerous, but they've already dealt with the Ammonites, and the Philistines are who they're fighting now. And the Philistines lived really interspersed with them within the land of Canaan, west of the Jordan. And so that was a difficult enemy that was a constant thorn in the side of Israel. C, Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear, and that's true. And D, Saul waited 7 days for Samuel, but Samuel did not come, and his troops began to scatter. Now, I just want to say this. It's easy to pass judgment on Saul, and of course, God does, and Samuel delivers that judgment. But for us, we need to be careful and slow to judge Saul harshly, because he was in a difficult situation where his life was threatened, and the army was much bigger than he was, and than his was, and his army was scattering, and the man of God who was supposed to be here already is nowhere to be found. So we're going to end up going to war without the blessing of God. And this sort of harkens back to the battles where they brought down the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured, and the Philistines ended up sending it back. But all that's been a part of our story. And what's funny is how similar this story sounds, and how much it seems like Saul is again depending on, he knows that he needs God in the battle. He didn't bring an item of God, but this sacrifice is so important that he feels like the sacrifice must be made, even if he does it wrong, that somehow this sacrifice being made will change something. And the thing is that God had a prescribed way for the sacrifice to be offered, and it wasn't Saul's place to offer it. And so we have a situation where Saul seems to be thinking that it's the sacrifice that's going to bring victory. And therefore he makes it, even though he makes it wrong. And that's why he felt justified in doing it. But in the end, he should have trusted in God and waited on God, even if it seemed like God was coming through at a later time. And this story somewhat reminds me of the story of Jesus and the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and what Lazarus's sisters said when Jesus wasn't there and he arrived. If you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. And so they just felt like Jesus needed to be there, and he was late. And Jesus works a greater miracle even as he comes late. And you wonder what it would look like if Saul had enough faith to wait on God, and to wait on God's representative in the priesthood, Samuel, before he acted. But instead, he acted as if he had no other choice, and chose to disobey God rather than trust in God and wait. And the reason I say we shouldn't judge Saul too harshly is not because what he did wasn't wrong, but it's because of how quickly we seem to do the exact same thing. So number 4 says, what did Saul do in 13:9? It says, so he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. And so the arrogance of taking on the place of the priesthood when that wasn't his role, after being given the role of king, and the lack of trust in God and lack of willingness to be able to wait on God was very apparent. Number 5 says, does it ever seem like God and his messengers, or the people you trust to help you know his will never come or aren't available? Yes or no? I think that happens a lot of times. And sometimes it feels like God's not coming through, but I know sometimes it feels like the person of God, our mentor, the person who disciples us, our pastor, never seems to be there when I need him. You know, where are you? And the question is it reasonable, first of all, to think that that person is always there when we need them, when we don't know when we're going to need them? And the answer is probably not. And then the question becomes, but is God still there? And the answer is always yes. But sometimes we don't know that he's there, or it doesn't seem like he's there, and he doesn't seem to be coming through, at least in the way that we would want him to, or expect him to. So I think we have this same experience as Saul pretty regularly, where we think we've been abandoned either by God or his people, but it's not true. We had somebody just in this last year who, you know, I was away at district meetings, I think, and Pastor James was on a trip or something, and Pastor Patty was doing something, and this person was really relying on humans who were trying to disciple him, but in the end, when he hit a crisis, those people weren't there, and so he just disappeared on us to go find him, and in the end chose to go out and be homeless and dive back into the old way of life, rather than seek God, or even find some other Christian brothers and sisters to help provide that support. And of course, that's a little different from what Saul did. Saul didn't just give up on God, but Saul did think he could do it himself, and go ahead himself in offering the sacrifice that he wasn't supposed to. The last part of this question says, describe a time when something like this has happened to you. I knew a pastor that had somebody that he was discipling, and they called all the time, and that was fine usually, but it got to a point where the person was calling the pastor before they prayed. And so I remember the pastor telling the story of how one day he just chose not to answer the phone, and it wasn't out of selfish motives, but it was realizing that this person was coming to lean on them instead of leaning on God, and they needed the absence of them in hopes that they would turn to God. And I remember the story was recounted to me after the fact that the pastor was talking to them. You weren't there, you didn't answer the phone. And he said, yes, because I wanted you to turn to God and not to me. And so we have that opportunity, because we don't offer sacrifices physically anymore, burnt offerings, but rather Jesus is our great high priest. So we have the opportunity to go directly to God and not be put exactly in the situation that Saul's in anymore. But the question is, do we? And do we believe that God is there and hearing us, even when we don't feel it, or even when we don't see something changing? So number 6 says, how did Samuel respond when he arrived? According to 13:10 through 14. A, he asked, what have you done? So he knew something had been done. Maybe he saw the remains. Maybe he smelled the burnt offerings. Maybe he just knew. Maybe God had already been speaking to him before he got there, and he knew what he was going to find when he arrived. But he asked Saul, what have you done? B, he told Saul he had done a foolish thing. Yes, he did that. C, he told Saul that he had not kept the command of the Lord. And if he had, the Lord would have established his kingdom over Israel for all time. And let me just say this. There are consequences for our actions. This is not a purely Old Testament thing where now God has erased all consequences and there's no consequences. A lot of people think that, but we need to understand that there are consequences for our actions. And even when we repent, it doesn't remove all consequences for our actions. And so what happened here is Saul was supposed to be the leader, the representative of God before the people, the king, that even though they had rejected God, Saul came to be the person that, as long as he obeyed God, represented God as the leader of the people. But if he's going ahead of God, and then he was no longer that. And so God immediately removed that kingdom from him. Now he didn't overthrow him that day, but the decision was already made, because this is somebody who is no longer small in his own eyes, but has grown large in his own eyes. He's grown arrogant to the point that he even took the place of the priest and offered sacrifice. And apparently doesn't think that that he needs God. You say, well, he offered sacrifice because he knew he needed God. Well, maybe, but he didn't want to wait on God's plan. He wanted to make what he thought God's plan was happen himself. And so there was a lot more of him in there than there was of God. And he had justified it and reasoned it out and decided for himself that it was God that he needed. But really, the fact that he went ahead without God or without Samuel showed that he really put himself in the place of God. D, he told Saul that God has already sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because Saul didn't keep the Lord's command. And that's true. And we'll continue with this story and find out who that is. Some of you already know, but that'll be a big part of the book of 1 Samuel. Number 7, did Saul's explanation seem to make a difference? This is important because Saul had what we would consider a good reason to do this, but it didn't. The thing that he did was wrong. It didn't matter that he had justified it in his mind and that he could explain it or blame it on somebody else. I think we need to hear that because we often have an explanation for doing the wrong thing that is good enough for us. It makes us feel better, but is it good enough for God? And somebody, one of our staff that was had been consistently late to a meeting that I had with them over a matter of weeks, and but they called or they texted and let me know I'm going to be late, which was fine. I appreciate that consideration. It's considerate to let somebody know if you're going to be late, but after like 4 or 5 weeks in a row, I text back, and when they got there, I talked to them about it and said, I appreciate you being considerate and letting me know that you're late, but when it happens consistently, then it's a pattern, and it doesn't matter that you let me know. We can't start on time, and it sets me back in my other meetings. And so whatever excuse or justification you've put that makes you feel like it's okay that you're late, and then you've justified yourself by texting me, and that way you let me know, and so you've eased your conscience. But let me just tell you, you're still doing the wrong thing. I don't think anybody's going to hell over being late. But so this is not exactly the same thing. But I'm just presenting a human sort of example of how it doesn't matter what the explanation is. At some point, you're still wrong. Stop doing that. Don't justify and feel okay about doing the wrong thing because you've explained it away or given it a reason. Because Samuel wasn't having any of Saul's reason, and I don't believe God was either. And number 8, what was Saul supposed to do? He couldn't go to battle without the Lord's favor. Didn't he have to make the sacrifice? See, this is I have a feeling that if we weren't reading this in scripture with the background knowledge that we know Saul was wrong in this, and we've already read the judgment about it, that most of us would be on Saul's side on this. So in other words, if a friend just came and told us this story, then we would side with Saul and not with Samuel and with God, because his reasoning seems legitimate. And so that's why I think it's so important. We need to understand, because how many times are we not only siding with a person over God when God is making a judgment, but how many times in our own life is God trying to make a judgment, but we're convinced that we're right and we won't hear what he's saying about that we need to change. And so we're not even repentant. So we're not even changing for the next time because we feel like we're justified in what we've been doing, and we feel like we're justified so much that we're not hearing and receiving the conviction of the Holy Spirit. We're not hearing the judgment that God has placed on our action. And I think that's why this is really important to understand, because our excuses don't make any difference at some point. And it's in one of the upcoming scriptures where Saul is told God desires obedience rather than sacrifice. So the sacrifice was not near as important as the obedience. And so, no, he didn't need the sacrifice to have God's favor in battle. First of all, he could have waited and saw what God did, but he needed to be obedient. He needed to be. So the problem was when Eli's sons brought the ark in the other story that we studied. The problem was that the ark being there did not make any difference, because the people carrying it wasn't about God. So number 9, what do you do when God doesn't seem to take care of things? A, I take matters into my own hands, and B, I wait on the Lord's timing. And I think that we know what we should do, but the question is, what do we do? And then what are we going to do now that we've heard the word of God?